All right. The last time I made a YouTube video, it was all the way back in 2019, which now feels like years ago. And when I was making that videos, we were talking about the year 2020 and how there was a lot of potential for new energies, big new forces to be hitting the planet, pushing humanity into the next step of its evolutionary process. So far in this year, in 2020, it seems as a lot of those energies are arriving and will continue to be with us for quite some time. So in this next series of videos, what I'm going to do is try to give a structure to these energies, to structure them out onto some kind of larger time frame, to give a context and attach it to a process that might give us more opportunity to understand where we are in time, which will help us gain more insights into ourselves and to the changes occurring in the world around us. So this chart here is, well, it's pretty complicated and it's sort of a mess, and I'm probably going to have to clean it up at some point. But this is the basic structure of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Now, this 50-year change cycle, there's many cycles. There's cycles within cycles within cycles. But this 50-year cycle is one that a lot of political scientists, sociologists, intellectuals use to talk about societies and how they go through different systems that push them along the path and then undergo entropy. This cycle that I will be focusing on, this 50-year change cycle, is global in nature. However, as much as I would love to take a completely global perspective, and I've tried that in the past, but it doesn't come off as completely authentic because I live in America and I definitely have an American perspective. In the past, I've tried to make it come off that to have a global perspective, but it never really resonates as much as if I take the American perspective and then let people from other countries take the model and apply it to their own situation. So this 50-year change cycle, while I will be mostly talking about events that occurred in America, it applies at the global level, and also the nature of these events were global in themselves, and so it will all sort of merge into one single global narrative. But before I launch into an explanation of this chart that you see in front of you, I just want to talk about this 50-year change cycle and show you how it does a great job in segmenting off different historical periods. I'm just going to run through 5 or 6 of them so you get a sense of how it encapsulates these different periods. If we start even before America became America with the 1730 to 1780 change cycle, that was the lead up to the Revolutionary War. 1780 to 1830 was basically 1776 through the Revolutionary War, through the founding of the Constitution and the early days of the Republic. The next cycle, 1830 to 1880, was the Civil War cycle and the immediate aftermath of Reconstruction in the South. The 1880 to 1930 cycle was the beginning of the vast growth of industrial production in America, the oil age, the corporate age, the construction and expansion of railroads across the nation. Now, as we get into the 20th century, this becomes a lot more clear for people. 1930 to 1980, and then that lasted right to the Great Depression, which sort of blew that era to pieces, and we entered a new world. That 1930 to 1980 cycle was the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War. And it was basically the consolidation of America as a single economy, a single economic unit, and a rising player, if not the chief player, on the global stage. Now, this next cycle that we're in now starts from the 1980s and goes until the beginning of the next decade. And the basic nature of this cycle is advanced technology, information technology, the internet, social media, and all of the ramifications that these new technologies, mostly coming from the private sector, the way that they impact all of us and our lives, and how they will shape the nature of life on this planet as we move forward along our journey. The cycle after this will be 2030 to 2080, and it will have a very different feeling to it, and we're not quite there yet, and there's really no point in even trying to talk too much about it yet, although we could, and maybe we will. But right now, I want to explain this chart before we get too far ahead into the future. Okay, so that's the basic idea of these 50-year cycles. If you buy into it, great. If you're skeptical, that's fine too. It is interesting, though, how those 50 years definitely delineate different historical periods, and you can apply it to America, and you can definitely apply it to other countries as well. So let's talk about this cycle. I'm going to run through this chart and give a very brief explanation of how all this applies, and then talk about how I'm going to use this chart to generate insights into smaller cycles that we go through in this year and the coming years as we max out in this cycle throughout this decade. In the late 1970s, there were a lot of challenges. The classic New Deal FDR system of government was hitting a lot of stagnation. There were a lot of shocks in the energy markets, and there was a general feeling of malaise in America and in many other countries in the world. What happened in the 1980s was we changed our model from a heavily public-based model of FDR's New Deal, which was heavily focused on the government and what the government could do to make people's lives better. And we shifted, starting with the Reagan-Thatcher reforms in the early 1980s, we shifted into a more private model to see what could the private sector do predominantly. There's always an interplay between the government sector and the private sector, especially in the US. In the 1980s, it shifted to a heavy private sector focus. And we began to see companies like Microsoft and Apple and personal computing and all kinds of new personal technologies that were now coming from the private sector. We had the internet was born for the public, and the public began to use the internet en masse throughout the 1990s. So this was the new world. This was the ordinary world of the 1980s. We'd moved past that heavier reliance on the New Deal policies of government, and there was a new energy in the air of the private sector returning to dominance and being a big player in the everyday lives of Americans on a much larger scale than we'd ever seen before. And there was a strong feeling of this throughout the 80s and into the 90s, and even up to the market challenges of the tech bubble bursting. But even when that tech bubble burst, there was still basically a general continuity of feeling from that had started in the 80s and built up through the 90s and into 2000 and 2001 of the private sector gaining steam and gaining dominance and really controlling most of what was happening on the global stage. Now, here's my model, okay? So this model that I have here can be applied to societies as a whole, and it can be applied to individuals. I've made other YouTube videos using this same basic model, which was talking about how larger forces, more macro forces, can come into your life and you can use them and you can sort of track them in the way that they develop throughout a cycle by following this chart. If you've already seen those videos, then this will make some sense to you. But you can also use it to track much larger changes. So I'm going to just run through it real quick. The way that humans change, the way that they develop and evolve, is there's a process to it. And this is my model of that process. It's not perfect. It doesn't always work. Sometimes adjustments need to be made. But it does a decent job of sort of describing how we go through the process of change. So you start off in the ordinary world. This is your current stasis. This is where things feel comfortable and you've sort of mastered all the old challenges and you're in a good place. Then, as we all know, one of the major aspects of life is change. Things don't just stay the same. When you reach a stasis, that's a good time to start thinking and preparing for big new things to come into your life. And usually that happens. And I call that process the thunderbolt of change. This is where everything that seemed like it was going to stay the same and be in stasis forever, well, no, it all gets flipped upside down and you're presented with new challenges. The call to adventure, and you get a lot of wake-up calls. These wake-up calls you can accept and you can deal with them, or you can kick the can down the road and refuse the call. But whether you accept these challenges or not, the process continues. If you decide to take the journey, if you decide to roll with these changes and continue to work with them and work with the energy and build the energy into your life, well, there's going to be even more upheaval. There's going to be even more twists and turns. That first big upheaval where things seem like they're really changing, or really getting out of control, or really sort of starting to not fit the model of reality that you had in your mind, is what I call shocks and surprises 1, where all this new stuff is coming in and a lot of it doesn't even start to make sense and you really don't know what to do with it. It becomes more challenging to use the old ways, to use the old methods, to use the old models that work so well in the ordinary world. Now it's a little bit iffy. You're still going along with it and still trying to do what you've always done, but it becomes a lot more difficult. So because of that, a lot of new energy is coming in, and those energies are expressed by tests and little pop quizzes and obstacles that spring up, and having to decide who's on your team and who's not on your team. When you go through this process, you definitely you start to gain a lot more power by working with these energies and understanding how to get through these little obstacles, these tests, and understanding who you should be in alliance with and who may not have your best interest at heart. And so eventually working with that process will lead you toward an expansion and a deeper understanding and progress with these energies. There'll still be challenges, but you'll feel like you're moving on a path toward a better understanding of how to work all this new stuff into your life so that you can continue along your path of evolution, get back to a new stasis or a new ordinary world. However, this process is very dynamic. It's always going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You gain and then you get pulled back. You gain and then you get pulled back. So even as you feel more expansion and more confidence with these new energies, the process is going to force you to keep working with them until they're deep, deep inside of you and can never be taken away. What it usually forces you to do next is to have some kind of breakdown. Everything, all the progress you thought you made, well, it turns out that it really wasn't built on rock, but was built on the shifting sands. However, the only reason you have that breakdown is to have a breakthrough, to have everything sort of smash apart, and you're forced to rebuild it, to rebuild all of the pieces into a new paradigm, a paradigm that's even more empowering than you ever began, than you started working with in the first place. This leads you to a big moment. You have to decide, are you going to keep dealing with these challenges even as they get more and more difficult and more time consuming and energy consuming? And you face the mirror moment where you look into the mirror and ask yourself, what kind of life do I want to live? What kind of person do I want to be? What kind of society do we want to build? Do we want to keep working with all this new stuff that came in at the thunderbolt of change, all this upheaval, all these crazy things that are happening that back in the ordinary world would have made no sense? But since you've been working with them and you've been rolling with the challenges, well, it's starting to make a little bit more sense. But the mirror moment is a commitment phase where you realize that to work with these energies, it's going to, and these new forces, these new macro forces or micro forces, it's going to require more time, more sacrifice, more energy. But the alternative is letting the whole thing crash down to the ground, not working this new stuff into your life and going through a major stagnation, a major paralysis. And so let's say that we look in the mirror and we say, yes, we need to keep pushing. We need to keep working with these energies. Well, are we rewarded from that? Well, we do get a great sense of accomplishment because we've had the courage to keep pushing. However, that's when the real change begins. That's when the real challenges start to come in and we move into a resistance phase. The resistance phase is very important because basically all the patterns that were holding us back, mostly some on the surface, but mostly deeper in the unconscious, then it's time to really drag them up. We go way down deep. Although we were dealing with all this new stuff, this new energy, these new forces on a surface level, it's time to really start to make them our own. And in order to do that, you have to go down deep and drag up all the stuff that was preventing you from doing this in the first place. And that can be very challenging because those deeper forces, they're way down there and they are in power and they have power over you and they do not want to be disturbed, not in any way. They don't understand why on earth you would want to change the stasis. Even though you had a thunderbolt of change and you had accepted a call to adventure and you've gone through shocks and surprises and you've passed the test and the obstacles, you've had expansion and you've made a new commitment in the mirror moment, they don't care about that. Those deeper entrenched forces in your life or in society, they're fine. They don't want to change. They want to hold on to their power. But if you really want to make all this new stuff yours in yourself, in your own psyche, or if a society really wants to make all this new stuff its own and really make the world a new and better place, it's going to have to drag up all that junk from the depths. But eventually that occurs, and once you start moving the new into the place of those old entrenched forces, you start to feel a sense of mastery. You really have been working these energies for a while now, either as yourself, an individual, a group, a tribe, or a society as a whole. You start to feel better, and you start to feel confident, and you start to feel like you've really got a handle on this. So you should get a huge congratulations and a huge pat on the back, right? No. Instead, it's time for the final test. You've been working with this stuff, and now it's time to see if you've really got a true handle on it. And that's usually when some kind of external shock and surprise, once again, most of these challenges here, some of it's inner, but a lot of it is coming from the outside, from the external world, and constantly challenging you. And usually, once you've got that feeling of mastery and that confidence, something huge will happen, something big, some huge shock and surprise that's going to challenge you in a way you haven't been challenged before, or challenge your society in a way it hasn't been challenged before, to see if you've really got this, to see if you can really make the final jump past the final exam, move the entire process, the new energy that started all the way back at the thunderbolt of change, if you can move it into the core of yourself, into the core of your tribes, into the core of the world. Once you can do that through some severe tests and some heavy trials, you make a new world for yourself or for your society as a whole. Okay, so that's a somewhat brief, quick explanation of the little model that I've built here. And I like this model and I've used it a lot, but sometimes I tinker with it. So I'm just throwing that out there because I'm going to keep putting this model up here as I make these videos. And if I change it, I'll probably talk about it. But sometimes I like to tinker with it. I come up with new descriptions, new words. And then these dates, I'm definitely reserving the right to move these dates around. You'll notice I've already primed you for that by putting multiple question marks after each date that comes after where we are now. There is a good chance that we'll be moving those dates around. And one of the reasons I'm making this next series of videos is to get a better handle on these dates and maybe get some feedback from all of you on your view on how some of all of this may go down as we move through the last 10 years of the 50-year cycle. Now, you'll realize with this chart, there's a lot of time packed into the beginning of it. You have 1980 through 2016 in the very first phases, and then towards the end, the time goes down to just to years. That seems to be a feature of human experience. You can take maybe a movie, right? In the beginning of the movie, the first 20 minutes cover a lot of time. You have to be introduced to the hero. You have to understand his world. You get a sense of who the bad guys are going to be. That's sort of the whole first act. It covers a lot more time than the other acts do. Now, the second act will cover not as much time as the first act, but it will still be a longer span of time of that third act. If you think of a lot of movies, that third act is just sometimes one big scene, one big showdown, or one big battle. And that's sort of how cycles play out too. The beginning is a lot of information, a lot of time, a lot of introductions, a lot of understanding where we're at. By the end of that cycle, you start to move faster and faster and faster. The time actually ends up being a very short amount of time compared to the rest of the movie. Those last few scenes are the first hour and a half of a movie might comprise weeks, months, years, but the last 10 or 20 minutes of a movie might just comprise, one day or 1 hour or 15 minutes. So that's sort of the model that I'm going off there. It not just in movies, it resonates in human experience as a whole, that as we near the peak of a cycle, things get more intense and a lot more things happen in a shorter amount of time. So I'm just going to run through this chart very quickly and explain the dates on it and why I've put them there. So I already explained the 1980s and the ordinary world. In 2001, along with the tech bubble, there was 9/11, and the ordinary world no longer felt the same after that. There were new challenges, a new call to adventure on many levels in the US and around the world. We moved deeper into this era of change during the years 2000 2007 and 2008. There was war, there was increasing global war, and the financial crisis put out a very loud call that things were changing. Institutions that once absorbed shocks and shifts were having a harder and harder time dealing with those changes. Extreme measures were now required to keep institutions standing in order to keep the free flow of capital around the globe, to keep the economic system around the globe functioning. For those who remember the 1980s and the tech bubble of the 1990s and its collapse, by the time you get to 2008, there's a very different feeling out there. There's a growing unease and a growing mistrust in institutions and their ability to face not only the present, but the future. This builds and builds through the first decade of the 21st century, through 2012, the election in 2012. By the year 2015, there are clear signs that the old way and the old way of doing things, the old way of communicating were no longer going to be accepted, that the status quo had changed and we weren't going back. That was best expressed through the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit vote. Now, since 2016, things have grown even more intense. We can see this in our financial institutions, our political institutions, our media institutions. They are under large and constant pressure on a global scale. So let's do a quick recap of where it began and where we are now. In the 1980s, a new age came in. People and capital were freed from restrictions that had been placed upon it during the New Deal era. There was tremendous growth and tremendous progress and a sense of the new and a sense of a new world, which became ordinary and people grew accustomed to it. That was challenged in a major way in 2001 with the popping of the tech bubble and 9/11. Things grew more intense as the war on terrorism, if you want to call it that, escalated across the globe, and there was major financial disruption in 2007, 2008. All of that progressed. There was sort of a crescendo of, look, things have changed and we're not going back to the old way in 2016. And now we are moving into a different phase where actually I'm going to leave it at that and we will pick back up with 2020 in my next video. Now, the point of these videos is not to go over the 50-year change cycle over and over again. It's to understand that macro level of where we're at and then to bring it down and really focus in that test, obstacles, allies, and enemies phase. Because within this larger 50-year cycle, there are much smaller cycles. And in those smaller cycles, we'll see at the individual level and at the level of society, there's going to be lots of new energies, lots of new patterns coming in. And we'll have to work with those energies and develop them in order to move deeper into the cycle. So in the next video, I'll talk more about 2020 and why I've put all these other dates on the model as we go deeper into the future, from 2021 to 2022 and deeper all the way into 2030.